all those who will do so. It's our pleasure to continue Wednesday night Kollel with Rabbi Moshe Wolbowski, teaching contemporary halachic issues based on the Parsha of the week. And it gives us some additional insights into the Parsha, but not only that, we get to understand some important insights into major halachic themes. Rabbi Wolbowski, bavakasha.
Okay, thank you very much, Rabbi Green, as always. I'm going to share my screen. And just to make a brief introduction, as we do every week, we're going to be focusing on topics in halacha. I actually like the way Rabbi Green put it. He said halachic themes. I think that would be a good way to describe sugyas in halacha. So we do, basically, these are matters of halacha, but we go to the background of the halacha. The background, the inner workings of the halacha, and ultimately we always end up at the depth of the halacha. We call it the nefesh halacha, sort of like the neshama, the soul of the halacha. Because once you reach the neshama of the halacha, it relates to us at all times and in all ways, and not just the particular details that the halacha is addressing. So now, and we always focus on topics that relate to the seder of the week. And in this week, we're going to be focusing on the topic of the mitzvah of tefillah. Not just, in general, but also some specifics in the mitzvah of tefillah. In the beginning of this week's parsha, the Torah tells us about Yaakov Avinu, Vayifka b'makom vayolan sham, which literally means that he reached the spot and he rested there. He reached the spot. Rashi tells us, Chazal tell us that Yaakov Avinu reached, Har Habayis, the Temple Mount. Chazal tell us that the word Vayifka, which translates to he met that place, he reached that spot, is a reference to davening. In other words, Yaakov Avinu davened Ma'ariv before going to sleep. That's something that the Torah tells us in the beginning of this week's parsha. So I would like to start with a general halacha of davening. In fact, it's the way the Rambam introduces the mitzvah of tefillah, the mitzvah of davening. And from there, it's going to take us to I think, a very beautiful understanding of what this mitzvah is. So we begin with the Rambam's introduction to the mitzvah of davening. The Rambam, in his book Sefer Ha'ava, the book of mitzvahs of love of Hashem, he starts the mitzvah, the Hilchos Tefillah, as follows. He writes, "Mitzvahs aseh liyispalel b'chol yom." It's a positive mitzvah to daven, a positive commandment to daven every single day. Shenemar, the pasuk says, "Va'avadatem es Hashem Elokeichem." You should serve Hashem. You should serve God, your Lord. Now, serving Hashem and davening are not necessarily the same thing. Why does it say? Why is that a proof? So the Rambam continues and he says, "Mipi hashmua lamdu she'avodah zu hi tefillah." It was passed down to us from tradition that the meaning of serving Hashem is davening. Shenemar, because we have another pasuk. The other pasuk says, "Ula'avdei b'chol levavchem." We know this from Shema. Ula'avdei, we serve Hashem b'chol levavchem, with your whole heart. So in other words, serving Hashem has to do with the heart. Amru Chachamim, our sages say, Ezu avodah shebelev. What does it mean, the service of the heart? How do you serve Hashem with your heart? Zu tefillah. It's referring to davening. Now, the Mefarshim on the Rambam, there are many Mefarshim on the Rambam. We call them the Noisei Klei HaRambam, those who carry the vessels of the Rambam. So one of the main ones is the Kesef Mishnah. But in general, the Mefarshim of the Rambam struggle with this halacha, starting with the Kesef Mishnah. The Kesef Mishnah asks a very simple question. And by the way, just to appreciate this question, you have to come from the same point of view, which is the Rambam doesn't elaborate on anything. Okay, every word in the Rambam is there for a halacha. And the Rambam, by the way, generally doesn't even bring psukim to prove his point, unless he has a reason to. In this case, he brings two psukim to establish the mitzvah of davening when he could have just brought one. He could have just brought the second pasuk. The pasuk says, "Ula'avdei b'chol levavchem," to serve Hashem with all your heart, and to tell us, our sages say, what does it mean to serve Hashem with all your heart? Serving Hashem with your heart means davening. Instead, the Rambam brings one pasuk, serve Hashem, and another one, serve Hashem with all your heart, and all your heart means davening. He takes two psukim to make his point, when seemingly We could have made that point. We would have understood that point. The point of the mitzvah of davening would have been established had he only brought one pasuk, the second pasuk, the first one where it says, "Shenemar v'avadatem es Hashem Elokeichem," you should serve Hashem. That is seemingly extra. That is a question that the Kesef Mishnah asks on the Rambam, and many Mefarshim try to answer for the Rambam. Starting with the Kiryas Sefer. Kiryas Sefer is the Ma'abit. He writes on the Rambam, and this is his explanation. He says that by the Rambam bringing the first pasuk, the Rambam is trying to establish something else. He's bringing a proof for another detail. Remember, the Rambam began his halacha that it's a mitzvah saseh, it's a positive mitzvah, not only to daven, but lispalel b'chol yom, to daven every day. He says this pasuk, v'avadatem es Hashem Elokeichem, is the proof. You should serve Hashem. That is the proof that you should daven daily. How is that the proof? So let's read his words. Beautiful, actually, explanation. He says, I'm going to start here where the arrow is. Mitzvahs aseh lispalel b'chol yom, samich asoife dekra. The Rambam is relying on the end of the pasuk. He's expecting us to know the end of the pasuk to see it as a proof. Because the ksiv, as the pasuk says after it says you should serve Hashem, it says uverach eislachmecha v'esmeimecha, and Hashem will bless your bread and your water. Tzarich kol yom. Dehu tzarich kol yom. Bread and water are staples, necessities of every day. Hachinami, here as well, the davening must be tefillah b'chol yom. He says basically the reason why the Rambam brings the first pasuk is not just to tell us about davening, it is adding an important point. It is adding the fact that we have to daven daily, every single day, because that very pasuk speaks about things that we need every day and speaks about things that sort of are blessings as a response of the davening. That Hashem gives us bread and water. Bread and water are needed every day. So too the davening is needed every day. Similar to the Lechem Mishnah, who also writes, on the Rambam, he says, "Lamash atashoyel tzorchecha ba," that the davening has to be every day because you have needs every day. Okay. Either way, the bottom line that we come out with here is that.
Tell to stay by it. Tell to stay by it.
Okay.
You hang up. Yeah, hang up and I'll call him back in 5 minutes, in 2 minutes.
Okay, I'll continue. Now, from here we see that the fact that the Rambam brings two verses to establish davening. The first, to establish the mitzvah of davening. The first verse he brings is serving Hashem. The second verse he brings is to serve Hashem b'chol levavchem, with all your heart. It seems obviously one of them adds the detail of davening every day, but the fact that the Rambam needs two psukim to establish the mitzvah of davening shows us the fact that the Rambam brings two psukim to establish the mitzvah of davening shows us that there are two elements of davening and there's two ideas in davening, and these two psukim are addressing davening from two different angles. As I said, on a simple level, one of them is teaching us what davening is with your heart. The other one is teaching us the fact that it has to be every day. But that's on the surface. The fact that the Rambam needs two psukim to establish the mitzvah of davening teaches us that there are really 2 points to davening that have to be addressed. And Be'ez Hashem, with Hashem's help, tonight's class, I would like to speak about those two ideas in davening. There are two ideas in davening, in the halachic element of davening, and obviously in the deeper element of davening, and that's what I would like to get to tonight. But in order to understand the two ideas of davening, I want to visit another thing, another idea that actually is more closely related to this week's parsha, and that is the three davenings, right? We have three tefillos every day, Shacharis, Mincha, and Ma'ariv. As the Mishnah says, Tfilos HaShachar ad Chatzos, Tfilos HaMincha ad Ha'erev, Tfilos HaErev ein lekeva. Shachris goes until Chatzos. This is obviously, there's all everything I'm reading, almost everything I'm saying now is up for debate. But Shachris goes up until Chatzos, till midday. Mincha goes until sunset. And Ma'ariv has no established time, meaning it goes throughout the night. That is the Mishnah in the beginning of the fourth parak of Brachas. The Pnei Yeshua on the Gemara asks a question. We know that when it comes to Kriya Shema, the mitzvah of reciting the Shema, which is the very first Mishnah in the entire Mishnayos and in the entire Gemara. The Mishnah first addresses the night Shema, the evening Shema, and only afterwards speaks about the morning Shema. Correct? The first Mishnah, Masai Koyrim Kriya Shema Ba'arvis. When do we start reading Shema at night? Is the first Mishnah of the entire Maseches Brachas, of the entire Shas, the entire Shisha Siddur Mishnah. All of Mishnayos begins with that. We begin speaking about the night Shema. Why is it that when we come to davening, we begin with Tfilas HaShachar, the morning davening? You see, the Gemara asks this question about Shema. Even if people are not big into, everyday daf yomi, at least the first daf we probably got. So the first daf, or at least sometime in our lives, we get to the first daf of brachas. And the first daf, right in the beginning of the Gemara asks, why is it that the Mishnah addresses the night before the day? And the Gemara gives two answers. The first answer is the fact that when it comes to Shema, the pasuk says, "B'shachtacha uvekumecha," when you lie down and when you rise. So the first time it mentions Shema, it's in relation to lying down. The beginning of the first part of the mitzvah is before you go to sleep. The second part of the mitzvah is when you wake up. The second answer the Gemara brings is Kibri Aseh Shalaylam, that the Mishnah is following the order of creation. When the world was created, the Torah tells us, Vayi Erev, Vayi Boker Yom Echad, that first there was evening, and then there was morning, and that created a day. So which one was first? Evening was first. That's why when the Mishnah describes the mitzvah of Shema, it starts with the evening before the morning. So the Pnei Yeshua asks, if that's true, if that's the case, it is the case, why is it that when it comes to davening, does the Mishnah flip the order? Why is it when it comes to davening, to tefillos, the Mishnah begins with Shachris, Mincha, then Ma'ariv, morning, afternoon, and then evening? That is the question the Pnei Yeshua asks. Why the change in order? The Pnei Yeshua's answer is that although it is true that the world was created night before day, Vayi Erev, Vayi Boker, and yes, it is true that when it comes to Shema, that's what the Mishnah does, that's the order the Mishnah keeps with. Nevertheless, davening runs on a different order. Davening, tefillah, runs on a different seder, a different structure. And the Pnei Yeshua explains, we know that the reason why there are three davenings is for one of two reasons, or I shouldn't say one of two, maybe both reasons. Number one, Avram instituted Shachris. We know that Avram davened after for the city of Sodom, for their benefit, he davened in the morning. Yitzchak davened. It says that Yitzchak went out to the field when Rivka was coming. And Yaakov davened in the beginning of this week's parsha. Avram davened in the morning, Yitzchak davened in the afternoon, and Yaakov davened in the evening. That's why we have Shachris, Mincha, Ma'ariv. So what's the order? Morning, afternoon, and then evening. The other reason why we have three davenings, three tefillos every day, is corresponding to the karbanos, to the carbon tamid, the daily carbon that was brought every day. We had the morning tamid, we had the evening, the afternoon tamid, bein arbayim, and then throughout the night, the leftovers of the offering, the leftovers of the karbanos would continue to burn, and that corresponds to Ma'ariv. So whichever way you look at it, whichever reasoning and rationale you're using for the three davenings, you're always starting in the morning and concluding at night. Shachris, Mincha, and then Ma'ariv. Says the Pnei Yeshua, that's the reason why the Mishnah changes the order when it comes to davening. When it comes to davening, the Mishnah goes by a different order, a unique order, an order that begins in the morning. Very good. Beautiful. Pnei Yeshua asks a question, gives an answer, pretty straightforward. By the way, if I could add, not very Pnei Yeshua-like in the sense that it's very simple. Usually Pnei Yeshua would be very deep. But in this case, it's a straightforward question, a very straightforward, I think, not complicated answer. The problem with this is that if we examine more in the Gemara, we will realize that in several places, the Gemara ascribes the order of beginning at night to the davenings, to the tefillahs. In other words, it's true that the Mishnah does lay it out, Shachris, Mincha, and last Ma'ariv. That's true. But when it comes to halacha, to the halachic ramifications of the davening, as we'll see in a few minutes, we'll notice that the Gemara begins the davening order from the night before. Where do we see that? So I want to quote a Gemara that's actually in that same parak, and it's a Gemara of dealing with the halachas of hashlama. Hashlama is if somebody misses davening. Someone forgot to daven Shachris, forgot to daven Mincha, forgot to daven Ma'ariv. What do you do? So the Gemara brings the following halacha. Ta'avla hispalel arvis. If somebody mistakenly did not daven Ma'ariv, mispalel b'shachris shtayim. He should daven 2 times in the morning. Now, when I say daven 2 times, I mean the Amida, the Shemana Esrei 2 times in the morning. Shachris, if he didn't daven Shachris in the morning, mispalel b'mincha shtayim. He should daven 2 during Mincha. Okay, those 2 are clear. If you didn't do the night before, you do the morning. If you didn't do the morning, you do the afternoon. How about if you didn't do the afternoon? The Gemara asks, how about if you didn't daven Mincha, should you be allowed to make up for it by davening 2 times Ma'ariv? Now, the Gemara doesn't just ask it as a question. The Gemara spells out the question and gives an analysis for this question. The Gemara continues and says like this: if you're going to say, the reason why when you don't daven the night before, you're able to make up for it in the morning is because the night before, the previous night, and this morning are one day. The Ksiv, as the pasuk says, so the night begins the day begins the night before. So the next morning, today in the morning, if I would have to make up for last night's Ma'ariv, it would actually be considered one day. But from today's Mincha to today's Ma'ariv is actually 2 different days. Halacha, but in this case, Tefillah b'makom karban hi, the davening is in place of a karban, became the avar yemei bata karbane. The rule by karbanis is once the day is done, there is no making up for it. When the day passes, it's not like you come the next day and you say, "Oi, we didn't do the karban yesterday, let's do it today." No, the day passes, the obligation passes, the ability passes. We lose a chance to make up for that karban. Should we apply the same rule to davening? Asks the Gemara. In other words, the Gemara is being very clear about this, that the order that we're following davening is first the night and then the day. Ma'ariv, Shachris, Mincha, that's the unit, not Shachris, Mincha, Ma'ariv. So we see that although the Mishnah does choose to lay it out, I'm using the word laid out specifically because I want to say that it's not halachic. When the Mishnah wants to lay it out, it says Shachris, Mincha, Ma'ariv. But when the Mishnah wants to speak about halacha, should we consider Ma'ariv the beginning of the next day or the conclusion of the previous day? We're going to consider it the beginning of the following day, which goes against what the Pnei Yeshua said before. The Pnei Yeshua said that davening is all about starting in the morning and ending at night. That's the way Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov go. That's the way the Karbanos go. Again, more than a question, I don't think we're faced with a big question, but we're faced with a recognition that davening entails 2 orders. An order that begins at the night before and an order that begins in the morning. An order that ends with Mincha and an order that ends with Ma'ariv. Now, one last proof to this is that when the Gemara wants to establish and speak about the 3 davenings, the Gemara says as follows: Yachol yispal adam kolayim kulay. A person might think that the obligation to daven is to daven the entire day. Some people might feel that way. They might feel maybe the urge to daven the whole day. So the Gemara continues, says, Kar mefurish al-yedei Daniel. Daniel made it clear. Daniel the prophet said, Zimnin tlasa, 3 times a day we daven. One might think, okay, 3 times, but you could do them in a row. You could wake up in the morning and daven 3 times, and that's your obligation for the whole day. David was already explicit and clear about that. The Ksiv, as David HaMelech writes, Erev v'vayker v'tzarayim. Listen to the order. Erev, evening, Vayker, morning, Tzarayim, afternoon. You see that again, the Gemara reverts back to the order similar to Kriya Shema, where it begins at Erev and ends at Saharayim with Mincha. The bottom line is, we're recognizing once again, similar to what we did by the Rambam, we're recognizing once again there are 2 happenings in davening. There are 2 orders in davening. There are 2 elements in davening. Element 1 begins with the night before. It begins with Ma'ariv, continues with Shachris, and concludes with Mincha. Element number 2 is an element of davening that begins with Shachris, Mincha, and then Ma'ariv. And I want to make one important point because it's going to come up in a few minutes. Which one of those 2 is the halachic one? The halachic one definitely begins with Ma'ariv the night before. In terms of the order that the Mishnah teaches it to us, maybe it tells us Shachris first and then Mincha Ma'ariv. But when it comes to halachic ramifications and details in halacha, we would consider Ma'ariv to be the first davening of the day. I just put a template together, but the template is still empty because we're still looking to try to understand why are there 2 orders, what do they mean, what do they represent, and what does it mean to me? Now, in general, it's not only davening. The idea that there are 2 separate orders in Jewish life is undeniable. You see, when it comes to Shabbos, obviously we begin Shabbos the night before. Just like when the world was created, Shabbos began. When after Friday, once it says like a Chavim, Shabbos began. However, when it comes to Karbanos, when it comes to offerings, we see time and again in the Torah that the way it calculates 2 days and a night, sometimes some Karbanos are allowed to be eaten for a day and a night, 2 days and a night. We always begin with the morning and end at night. Not the way of like we do on Shabbos. And the Gemara addresses this. The Gemara says, what's the rule? What is the rule? When do we start the day in the morning and when do we start the day at night? And the Gemara in Chulin makes it very simple. The simple rule that you could always follow is the Ma'aseh Bereishis, in matters that relate to creation, Hayoim Hoylech Achar Laila. The day comes after the night. In other words, night is first and then is day. Bikachim, in matters of holiness, which obviously particularly applies to Karbanis, specifically Karbanis, then Laila Hoylech Achar Hayoim. The night follows the day is first. That's the rule. If you're dealing with something to do with creation, for example, Shabbos, right? Shabbos is obviously a day that we recognize creation and Hashem's rest of creation, so that rest from creation. So we start with the night and continue with the day. When it comes to Kodshim, matters of holiness, we start with the day and the night comes afterwards. Now that we know that, we could go back to davening, and let us dig into davening, and let us find in davening itself how davening, the idea of davening, represents both Ma'aseh Bereishis, a matter of creation, and Kodshim, a matter of holiness. Let's start with the second one, a matter of holiness. As we quoted before from the Rambam, the source of davening in the Torah is La'avdi b'chalavavchem, as the Gemara says, Eizu hi avoida shibalev, have oimer zu tefillah. Davening is an avoida shibalev. It's a service of the heart, where we awaken our heart to love Hashem, to have fear, awe of Hashem. That's what davening is. That is obviously kachim. That is holy. However, at the same time, one cannot deny that the literal translation of the word tefillah is to ask for something. We're asking for physical, personal requests. We're asking for things. We're asking for Baruch Aleinu, for a Parnasa, for Rifa'enu, for Refuah, for health. We are asking for things. So davening right here has both kachim, holiness, and it also has, a material side to it, a physical side to it, a Maisa Bereshis side to it, related to creation. Now, I want to point out that these two elements in davening, on the surface, if we think about it, are actually opposites to a degree, or at least they're very different. Because on one hand, when we speak about davening being kachim, being the avodah shabalev, the work of the heart, we know that the Mishnah says in Brachas, Chasidim harishonim hayushayim sha'achas mispalim, that the original Chasidim in the times of the Mishnah, they would spend an hour, a complete hour, preparing for davening to direct their hearts, to have proper concentration and to have the right intentions when they daven. A complete hour. So what do you think they did for a full hour? What would they do for an hour? So the Torah actually explains. The Torah says they spent this hour escaping the physical, escaping the material. And he writes it in undeniable terms and unconfusing terms, very straightforward. He says, they would sit alone, and to concentrate on their davening, to the point that they would come to an escape from the physical, and to give strength to the spirit of the mind. They had a sort of a sense of what it meant to be a navi, to be a prophet. The prophets tell us a lot about how they would have to do things to leave their material being. They would, tumble on the floor. They would make, these are things that they have to do to get rid of their physical shell, if you might imagine it that way. And really, the Chasidim Harishonim, the Mishnah tells us, and the Torah brings it in Halacha, that we have to have this part of davening where we're disconnected from the physical. To quote actually Shulchan Aruch, there's a quote from Shulchan Aruch. Shulchan Aruch says that the davening is hiskashus adon HaKol Baruch Hu, a connection and a bond to the Master of all things, of all being, b'yira with fear, v'ava aza, and a strong love, udveikus amitis, and a true unity. Now, when a person is in that state, you really think they're worried about their parnasa, their physical needs? They're not worried about their physical needs. When they're in that state, their physical needs are not important. Their physical needs are trivial. But at the same time, davening is specifically bakashat tzrachav. Bakashat tzrachav means to ask for what you need. As we'll see soon, the definition of davening is you need something, ask HaKadosh Baruch Hu, ask Hashem. So what do we see? We're noticing how in davening, there are these two elements of davening that are working alongside each other. There is the kachim of davening, the holiness of davening, where we leave and escape the physical, and there is the material part of davening, the material aspect of davening, where we are asking for physical things. So it's private, I'm sorry, I didn't realize. Somebody asked in the chat, before the Great Assembly created the Amidah, how did people know what to daven? Which is, by the way, I know it's not, might not seem very related to the point here, but it actually relates exactly to this. Because what the greatest members of the Great Assembly did was to give us the language of how to know what to ask, or not how to know how to ask, but the essential mitzvah of asking for what you need has always been a mitzvah before them as well. You wake up in the morning, by the way, I would say that it doesn't have to be in Lashon HaKodesh, it could be in English. You wake up and you say, Hashem, I need this. I need refuah. I need good health. I need parnasa. That's really what the definition of davening is. Before I go further, I want to just share something. I didn't even have this prepared in my notes, but I came while I'm saying it now, I'm remembering that the Magen Avram, I think it is, that in Shulchan Aruch, he says about davening, he says that when a person davens, Yehei Einav Lamata V'Liboy Lamaila. His eyes should face towards the earth, towards the ground, V'Liboy, and his heart to heaven. Now that sounds like of course, that's the position. Your eyes should be looking down and your heart to heaven. But it also goes deeper. It speaks of the theme of davening. Your heart should be to Hashem, but your eyes meaning your focus about what you're asking for should be about material things. It's a very interesting blend or harmony, I should say, of these two extremes. On one hand, you're giving Hashem your whole heart. At the same time, you're supposed to ask for what you need. Which is, by the way, it's a question of how to deal with that harmony. And I have a feeling we're going to get to it another time as well. But today I want to speak about it and address that harmony. Now, so we have these two elements of davening. But when it comes to halacha, what is the halacha? Excuse me again. The halacha of the davening is that we ask for what we need. That is the definition of davening. To explain what we're saying now, in terms of lamdus, some might say in terms of brisk, right? The brisker through school of thought and the way they study Gemara and study halacha. So the following statement is a very brisk statement. When I say brisk, I mean like Soloveitchik brisk. I don't mean the brisker Rav. So a lot of the brisker teachings analyze every halacha from the point of view of Gavra or Chefza. Gavra being the person, or Chefza being the object. So Gavra, Chefza, is the obligation on the person, the obligation on the object, and which is interesting. I think we mentioned a few weeks ago with regards to Achnasas Archim. I don't want to get into it, but we did address this a little bit. In any case, the object of davening, if you could even use that term, the chefza of davening, what is the mitzvah of davening? The mitzvah of davening is asking for your needs. But the person asking for his needs to be in a particular position. That is the gavra of davening. Okay, so the gavra, you have to ask for your needs, but you have to be in a sort of elevated position, at an elevated space, elevated feeling, which is connected to Hashem with all your heart. So you see this? There's the davening itself, and then there's the person doing the davening. And that's the point we're holding now. Now, in the Rambam, we see this again. Let's go. I'm not going to read the Rambam inside because we read it before, but we see that the Rambam brings these two psukim. He brings a pasuk, "Va'avadatem es Hashem Elokeichem," to serve Hashem. That is the mitzvah of davening every day. And then he brings an additional pasuk to tell us of a person's standing, a person's position that they must be while they daven. And that is b'chol levavchem, the entire heart, with all your heart. In other words, he speaks about first the material element of davening, asking for your needs, and then he addresses the spiritual, holy element of the davening. In fact, it's interesting to notice, and in general, this is a very interesting idea for those who are not familiar with this sort of evolution of davening. Because sometimes when we live in a time that we're grateful for the fact we can go to shul, take out a siddur, and just read the siddur. You start from page 20 to page 80, you did chakras, whatever that is. But it was evolved. It evolved to become that way. It's not just pages. And one of the things I want to focus on is in Shemona Esrei itself, which Shemona Esrei, the 18 brachas, which if you count is actually 19, but it's 18 plus 1. The structure of that davening, of the Amida, is very specific. There's 3 in the beginning, there's 3 at the end, and by the way, these 6, the 3 in the beginning, 3 at the end, never change. Not Shabbos, not Yom Tif, not Rosh Hashanah, not Yom Kippur. They're always there. And then there's 12 or 13 in the middle. The 12 in the middle are for us to ask personal needs. Every one of us asking for our needs. The 3 in the beginning is really praising Hashem. The other three at the end is more thanking Hashem, different forms of praising Hashem. And then there's the middle. In other words, that structure, I think, really emphasizes the point that we're learning tonight. There's the core of the davening, which is the mitzvah, the essential mitzvah, asking for what you need. But imagine that's here. You have to reach it. And you have to reach it. How do you reach it? You reach it by doing the 3 brachas in the beginning and 3 brachas at the end. In other words, there's the davening itself, and then there's me being in the position to ask for what I need. And in order for me to ask for what I need, I have to put myself into the davening with kavanah, with b'chol avavchem, with my whole heart. So these are the 2 elements of davening. The ma'aseh bereishis in davening, related to creation, my needs, physical, material needs. And then there is the holiness of davening, the kutshim of davening, which is the part of the davening where we're sort of leaving the material and leaving the physical. It's interesting to point out what I just said, spelled out in the next halacha in Rambam. He says, Chiyav mitzvah zu kachu. This, you want to summarize what this mitzvah of davening is? It's as follows. Adam ischanin u'mispalo b'chol yom. That a person should offer supplications and daven and pray every day. And then the Rambam says how to do it. Magad shivcha shel Kadosh Baruch Hu, he praises Hashem. V'achar kach shel tzrachav, then you ask for what you need. Shu tzarich lahem, which you are in need of. Bevakasha u'betchina, with request and supplication. V'achar kach, when you're done asking for what you need, noisen shevach v'edar l'Hashem ala tova sheishpia lo kol echad afikveichai, you thank Hashem for what He gives you. Again, you see, there's the core, asking for what you need, and then there's the before and there's the after. There's you, the gavra, not the chefta of the davening, you reaching that davening. And as I said, in the Rambam's words, we see there's the pasuk, v'avadatem, serving Hashem, that's the object of davening, asking for what you need. With all your heart, that's the position of the person, the gavra, in his davening. Okay, you see, it's blank, but I'm not done. I just want to say that up until now, we have now an understanding of why the Rambam divides the mitzvah with two psukim, why the Gemara chooses sometimes to calculate the davening starting from Shachris and sometimes from Ma'ariv, because there are these 2 elements in davening, there are these 2 aspects in davening. However, the bottom line, the halacha in davening is we consider the night to be the beginning. With that in mind, I would like to go, as we do every week, to try to delve a little deeper into this halacha. Because we quoted a rule, right? What was the rule? The rule was, we quoted the Gemara in Chulin, that when dealing with matters of holiness, we start with the morning. When dealing with matters of creation, we start at the night. Why is that the rule? So here's where we have a Hasidic explanation that really adds a lot of beauty and a lot of, I would say, geschmack to this whole idea. The reason why when it comes to matters of holiness, we begin with the day is because by definition, dealing with holiness is you're starting at a place of light. Starting at a place of light. You're studying Torah. You're dealing with light. You're doing a mitzvah. You're dealing with light. You're dealing with, when I say light, I mean divine light. I mean godly light, brightness, and then you're continuing to ascend in that light, sort of purely positive. Even when you reach darkness, it's not a negative, because the darkness that we're talking about in this case that comes after the light is a darkness of when you reach a point where you recognize the greatness of Hashem, and makes us feel dark only just makes us feel batul, meaning makes us feel self-nullification, makes us feel small. But it's not a darkness of, concealment of Hashem. However, when we deal with matters of creation, when we're dealing with worldly things, by definition, we're starting at a place of darkness. We're starting at a place where godliness is hidden. And we have to transform that to light. So Kachim, the rule is, holiness, matters of holiness, we're always starting with light, because that's just the nature of dealing with holiness. When it comes with material things and physical things, by nature, you're dealing with darkness. And you're fighting that, bringing light. It's interesting that in our Ma'ariv davening, the Brichas Kriyashma that we say during Ma'ariv, the expression is Goylal Or Mipnei Choshech, V'Choshech Mipnei Or, that Hashem rolls away the light to bring darkness, and then rolls away the darkness to bring light. Chassidus teaches in our life, we have those two directions as well. Hashem does it, and He wants us to do it. Sometimes we roll away light to get darkness. In other words, a greater level within the light. And sometimes we roll away darkness, meaning the darkness of this world that conceals the presence of Hashem, mipnei or, in order to bring light. These are the two elements in davening. In our davening, every one of us, we have the light of the davening, that's purely light, and we have, I don't want to call it darkness, but the davening where the davening is coming to affect the darkness. You see, truthfully, davening is an expression of our neshama, right? We want to get close to Hashem. So why do you have to say the words of davening? The main point is you think it, you feel it. What's the idea of verbalizing it? The halacha is we must verbalize the words of davening because our davening has to have a worldly impact. So in other words, in the davening, you have an expression of the neshama, which is godly, it's holy, it's kachim. And then there's the element of the davening where we're trying to make a change in this world, bring holiness to this world, transform the world to make it a holy place. So when we start the davening from a place of holiness, place of light, we start with Shachris, we go higher and higher, Shachris, the Mincha, Ma'ariv, Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov. Yaakov is considered Bechir Sheba Avos, the greatest of the Avos. And that's why it's the third, it's sort of the climax of the day. Because we started with light and we continued going higher and higher within light. However, the halacha is that the order begins with the night. Because the ultimate purpose of our davening, and really the ultimate purpose and objective and goal of the life of a Jew, is not only to live in light, but to transform darkness. That the darkness should become light as well. In other words, that the world around us, the physical world, our speech, should also be elevated and brightened. And therefore, we start with Ma'ariv, darkness. We continue with Shachris, and then we go to Mincha. It says concludes with Shachris. It should really say continues with Shachris. In any case, and this, to make this point and sort of to drive it home, we know it's brought in many places that one of the great advantages of the mitzvah of davening Mincha over even Shachris and Ma'ariv, this is brought in several places in Mefarshim on the Gemara as well. But one of the great advantages of Mincha is that a person, or Shachris is the beginning of the day, Ma'ariv is the end of the day. Mincha is when we tear ourselves away from the day. We're involved in material things and physical things, and yet we tear ourselves away to connect with Hashem. In other words, Mincha is perhaps the extreme of this idea of transforming darkness to light. And that's why it's very appropriate that the order that begins with night, with Ma'ariv, where does it climax? Where does it come to its peak? With Mincha. Because Mincha embodies this idea of darkness becoming light in the greatest form. Which also brings me to this conclusion, which is, Gemara says that a person should be very careful with the davening of Mincha, because Eliyahu Hanavi was answered during Mincha, right? With Har Carmel and on Mount Carmel when he was against the Nevi'im, against the prophets of the Baal. So it says that he waited till Mincha time to daven, and that's when Hashem answered him. So Eliyahu Hanavi, why is Eliyahu Hanavi so associated with Mincha more than anyone else? Eliyahu Hanavi, as we know, represents Mevaser HaGeula, the one who ushers in the future Geula, the Mashiach's coming. In other words, Eliyahu represents this idea of the world becoming holy, the transformation of the darkness to light. The reason why it is Eliyahu specifically that lives this idea of the advantage of mincha is because that's what he lives for, of transforming the darkness to light, which mincha has it in its greatest form, more than the other daven. So now I'm going to summarize what we did. We began with the Rambam, and we pointed out how the Rambam, we pointed out how the Rambam brings two psukim to teach us about davening. And we questioned that. We pointed out that the Mefarshim and the Rambam questioned that. Why does he need two psukim to address davening, to establish the mitzvah of davening? To explain that, we went into the Gemara that had two different orders of davening. One order that begins at night and one order that begins in the day. And we noticed that when it comes to halacha, the Gemara always starts with the night as the beginning of the davening. When the Gemara speaks about the order of davening outside of halacha, almost like, just teaching it to us, the concept of davening, so it starts in the morning. And we noticed that the rules change based on if we consider davening briyaseh shel olam, a matter that relates to creation, or do we consider davening a matter that relates to kachim, to holiness? Because davening does entail both those elements. On one hand, davening is our connection to Hashem in the greatest form, b'chol levavchem, our whole heart. On the other hand, the davening is supposed to be about material, physical things, asking for what we need. And that's the halachic definition of davening. And based on that, we realized how when it comes to halacha, we're starting with night, because that's when, things that related to creation begin. And when we're dealing with holiness, we start in the morning. But we didn't just stop there, we went deeper to recognize the reason why, when dealing with holiness, do we start in the morning, and dealing with creation, we start at night. Because when dealing with holiness, you're starting at a point of light, and you're gradually growing within that. But when dealing with matters of creation, we start at a point of darkness, and we transform the darkness to light. When it comes to halacha, in other words, the bottom line, the goal, purpose, and objective of the life of a Yid, the life of a Jew, it is that transformation. A transformation that begins with Ma'ariv, begins with darkness, it continues with Shachris. And where does it climax? Where does it hit the peak? With Mincha. Because Mincha is the ultimate of transformation of darkness to light. And that's why Eliyahu HaNavi in particular is associated to Mincha, because he is the one who ushers in the Geula, the time when the world will be transformed to light. Thank you very much, everybody, for participating and coming tonight. And Be'ez Hashem, looking forward to next week.
Yeah, Shikoach.
Thank you so much. It's a really beautiful idea. I really enjoyed this year.
Thank you very much. It means a lot. It really does. And I appreciate that.
Everybody stay well and have a pleasant evening, as well as a happy Thanksgiving.
To you as well.
Thank you. You too.
Were you able to get the sources before?
I did, yes.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Thank you. Great. Thank you. It's very helpful to be able to follow along and take notes as you're speaking.
Okay, I'm gonna attempt to do that in the future as well. I don't want to guarantee, but I will attempt to have it ready on time.
Okay. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.